because the God of the Judeo-Christian Bible was not only a God of order, not only a God of reason, but a God who was free. He could create any number of different ways. There's any number of different orderly forms that he might have used to create a planetary system. You have to go out and look and see which one he did, which one he did use.
Well, hi, everyone. Welcome to the Framework Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Kent Ingle, president of Southeastern University. And joining me is our co-host, Michael Steiner, SCU Senior Vice President for Advancement and Innovation. Excited to introduce our guest for today's show, Dr. Stephen Meyer. We're so glad, Dr. Meyer, you're joining us for this special series, Designed to Lead, where faith, science, and culture come together. And in this journey, we're going to be exploring how the idea of intelligent design shapes far more than scientific theory, but it actually speaks into our leadership, our values, and the way that we live out our faith in today's world. So we're honored to have you a part of this conversation today.
I'm honored to be with you and to be with both of you.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Unexpected treat. Yeah,
thank you. I want to say Dr. Meyer is one of the world's leading voices in the conversation on science and faith, a philosopher of science, a former he's the director currently of the Discovery of Institute Center for Science and Culture. He earned his PhD in the philosophy of science from the University of Cambridge, is the author of several amazing, influential books, including Signature in the Cell, Darwin's Doubt, and The Return of God Hypothesis. And so we're excited for this conversation. As we start the conversation, let's begin looking back. You've written and spoken extensively how modern science really was actually birthed out of a Christian worldview.
Yeah, it's maybe a bit ironic, but I'm speaking to you this evening from Cambridge University, okay. or Cambridge, and we have a new study center here adjacent to the university called the Hewell Center for Science and Natural Theology. And the origins of modern science in the 16th and 17th century in particular really bear the stamp of the biblical worldview, the Judeo-Christian worldview. That science in its modern form, as scientists began to develop systematic methods for investigating nature, was born out of a number of very specific Christian assumptions about the relationship between God and nature. Maybe the first and most important one was the idea that nature is intelligible, that it can be understood, right. that it has a lawful order, and a design, and that design and order can be understood because the same God who imparted that design and that order into nature made our minds in such a way that we could understand it. Because we're made in his image, and because he is a creative, rational agent, we can understand his creation and the rationality he built into it. And so this gave people confidence that nature had a kind of secret to reveal if we studied it carefully. And the closely aligned with that idea was the idea that in studying nature, we were studying the works of the Creator. Mm-hmm. There was a famous 17th century scientist named John Ray, who directly and indirectly influenced Newton. And Ray was a botanist. He's considered to be the father of modern biology by many, certainly of botany. And he wrote a book called The Wisdom of God Manifested in the Works of Creation. And the title was a rough paraphrase of that passage in Romans 1 about the unseen qualities of the Creator are clearly manifest in the things that are made, as St. Paul said. Mm-hmm. So you get this idea of nature being intelligible, studying it as a means by which we give glory to God, the Creator, and the idea that there are laws that can be understood because God is a God of order. And this is a concept that comes out of the Hebrew Bible. So all of these things emerged in full force in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries in Europe, when Europe was very much imbued with a Christian ethos and a Christian worldview. Mm-hmm. And so when historians of science look back and say, well, why did science get started and when it did, where it did, many have concluded that it had to do with the worldview that was predominant at that time.
And tell us a little bit,
And Cambridge happens to be a place where a lot of that happened, including John Ray and Isaac Newton. Yeah.
That's fun. And you're coming right to us from Cambridge. And so tell us a little bit more about why having this worldview of a creator matters. I think there's a lot of people today that say, it doesn't really matter for science. We can't know it for sure or not know it for sure. Why does having this worldview that there is an intelligent designer and creator that's a part of everything that we see, why does that matter for your worldview?
Well, it mattered. It's mattered in different ways in different times. But during the period that historians call the scientific revolution, this conviction in the intelligibility of nature was one of the huge ideas that inspired modern science. So was the idea that there were laws to be discovered, and there are passages in the book of Job and in the prophets that indicate that God has set boundaries on the way that nature can behave, and that there is a lawful order. Colossians 1 speaks about in Christ all things are held together, and there's a rough paraphrase of that verse in Newton's General Scholium to the Principia, his famous work on gravity. But there was another idea that was really important during the period of the scientific revolution that set modern science free from some of the thought forms that had dominated the Greco-Roman world. The Greeks had the idea that there was an order in the world, but they believed that the order was a kind of, they called it the logos, and they believed that the order was built into nature, that it was almost the foundational thing in nature, and it was self-evident to any rational person. So we could know, they also believed you could know the order, but they believed you could know it almost by deduction or by contemplation without having to observe nature, because there was really only the order should be self-evident. So the most rational way to build a planetary system would be to use circles, because circles were the obviously most rational way to do things. They were the most perfect form of motion. So for 2,000 years, people were committed to the idea that you had circular orbits, even though the evidence was showing that the orbits were, yes, very orderly, describable by mathematics, but more like ellipses. And so the idea that nature, the key idea that historians of science have identified is the idea that nature is contingent, because the God of the Judeo-Christian Bible was not only a God of order, not only a God of reason, but a God who was free. He could create any number of different ways. There's any number of different orderly forms that he might have used to create a planetary system. You have to go out and look and see which one he did, which one he did use. Robert Boyle, the great chemist, who also was from the same period of time in the 17th century, said it's not up to the natural philosopher, which was what people called scientists at the time. It's not up to the natural philosopher to determine what God must have done, but rather to go out and look and see to determine what he did do. And so the doctrine of creation, the Christian doctrine of creation, with the idea of God exercising not only creativity but freedom to create in different ways, implied the need to observe. And that gave rise to a different kind of science than the Greeks had typically done, an observational science rather than armchair philosophizing.
Yeah. As you've unfolded and walked through the historical assumptions from the 16th and 17th centuries, it's fascinating. So much of what we consider all this incredible scientific progress came from people who believed the world was intelligible because it was designed. And I think that is so significant.
Which fits with your theme at Southeastern University.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
It's right on our mission. Absolutely. Let's talk about the shift. Go ahead.
Oh, well, I was just going to add one other thing about why the notion of a creator matters today.
Yes.
Because what we're seeing happening in a number of fields is scientists turning double backflips, tying themselves into pretzels, coming up with extremely convoluted hypotheses to avoid what I call the God hypothesis.
Yes.
You may have heard about something called the fine-tuning, that the basic parameters of physics are finely tuned to allow for life to exist. That is, they fall within very narrow ranges or tolerances outside of which not only life, but even basic chemistry would be impossible in the universe. And the odds of all these parameters falling within those narrow tolerances is astronomically small. And the physicists who first discovered this said, this looks like the universe was a setup job, that it
Yep.
is finely tuned because there was a fine tuner.
Yep.
But more recently, physicists committed to a materialistic or naturalistic worldview, one that has no role for God in it, have said, well, we can't allow that. So they've come up with a hypothesis known as the multiverse. And they've posit a gabillion other universes. That's a technical term in math, a gabillion. Billions and billions of other universes out there. And suggested that, well, ours it just happens to be the lucky one. And that there wasn't a designing intelligence. There was not a fine tuner. It was just a giant lottery. And there are all kinds of problems with this hypothesis, in particular, that the physical processes that would give rise to multiple universes themselves have to be finely tuned, so they never really get rid of the fine tuning. But you get this extremely convoluted hypothesis that involves multiple theoretical entities, as opposed to the single, very sensible idea that if you have something that's finely tuned, there was an intelligence that fine-tuned it. And you see similar things in origin of life research, where people have acknowledged that the odds of generating life in a so-called prebiotic soup are beyond impossible. And so they're positing, well, maybe life was designed in outer space by an alien and then transported here. And I kid you not, Richard Dawkins has floated this idea. Even Francis Crick floated this idea. So the aversion to theism, the aversion to the God hypothesis, is causing scientists to adopt hypotheses that are almost transparently absurd. And so you can see the value of a theistic framework. It allows us to maintain kind of a coherent view of reality without turning ourselves into theoretical pretzels.
Well, I want to jump up and down a little bit. What are some of you write extensively on some of the consequences that have happened, particularly in the 19th century, because science tried to embrace this anti-theistic explanations for the universe. Can you walk us through some of the real things that have happened because of this worldview?
Well, sure. There were three great. Kind of the story I tell in Return of the God Hypothesis kind of has a rise, fall, rise plot structure. Science rises in a Judeo-Christian milieu in the 16th and 17th centuries. Probably the roots of that go back further. Then in the late 18th and especially the 19th century, that perspective starts to wane, and science becomes associated with a philosophical system of thought known as materialism. The idea that matter and energy are the thing from which everything else comes, that they are eternal and self-existent and self-creating, self-organizing, so you don't really need to invoke a creator. And you get three great materialistic thinkers that arise in the 19th century, many more than that, but three that are especially noteworthy. One, of course, is Charles Darwin, who has a creation story that does not require invoking a designing intelligence of any kind. His mechanism of natural selection acting on random variations, he argues, is completely sufficient to produce all the forms of life we see, except maybe the first, and then other people come along and come up with an evolutionary explanation, they think, for the origin of the first cell. Then, in addition, Darwin influences some other really important figures, and one of those is Marx. And Marx has a very utopian, materialistic view of the future, how the class struggle will eventually result in a kind of communist, egalitarian, utopian society where each is given according to his need and each produces according to his ability, and everything is hunky-dory. And then a little bit later in the early 20th century, you get Freud. And Freud tells us what to do about our guilt and addresses the human condition from a purely materialistic but psychological point of view. And so as you enter the 20th century, you have this kind of comprehensive materialistic worldview emerging where Darwin provides a creation story, Marx an eschatology, and Freud a kind of answers questions about what do we do about the human condition? What do we do about the sorry state of human beings, what Christians would call the fall. And so you've got creation, fall, redemption, but in a materialistic framework.
Wow.
And that framework really dominates the 20th century. And we see all kinds of consequences of that materialistic way of thinking. You see it in politics with the rise of the totalitarian regimes that reject a law above the state. And in those regimes, you have as Paul Johnson, the British historian, documented. You have genocide as a consequence.
Yep.
You have Dostoevsky, the famous Russian writer, said that if God is dead, then all things are lawful.
Yep.
And so the rise of a kind of moral relativism as a default ethical thinking
Yep.
in Western culture as well as other places emerges. That has, I think, right up to the present time, led to a kind of moral chaos. You have gender confusion because there's the denial of a kind of pre-given design that applies to male and female as much as anything else. And I really could go on. In economics, you lose the idea that human beings are made in the image of God and therefore capable of creating wealth. And economic systems tend then in a materialistic direction. Of course, the Marxist system was very much a system based on what's called a dialectical materialism. The class struggle dictates all the economic systems. But even in the West, you have ideas like the idea that the wealth is a kind of finite pie. It's the source of wealth is just the material stuff in the ground, and you overlook the role of human ingenuity in the creation of wealth.
Wow.
And so you have an effect in economics, in ethics, in politics, right across the board. So we have a little tree diagram where we show the materialist worldview as the trunk of the tree, the roots in Marx, Freud, and Darwin, and then on the branches, the fruit of that materialistic way of thinking. Another is the denial of the sanctity of life and the whole idea that the human fetus is essentially expendable because it's just tissue. So it's just material. So materialism, I think, has been a blight on Western culture in many, many ways. The Proverbs say that as a man thinketh, so shall he act. And this way of thinking has resulted in actions that have been very destructive to human life and to human culture.
Let me ask you this. Do you think the church fully recognized those shifts at the time, or was there a slow erosion of confidence in the compatibility between science and belief?
I think we've been, in the Christian world, somewhat slow coming to the party, recognizing the deep intellectual roots of what we're fighting.
Right.
And there was, in the 1920s, historians in American religious historians talk about the fundamentalist modernist split. And you have, coming out of the late 19th century, the Darwinism, Marxism, and a materialistic philosophy that's tying itself to science. It says materialism is justified, naturalism as a worldview is justified because of science. And so one response to that in the church in the 1920s, in America in particular, was the response of liberal theology, which said, well, if science leads to atheism, it was more this. If science undermines the credibility of the Christian faith, we've got to get rid of those parts of the Christian faith that seem to be going against science. And so, in particular, the elements in the biblical narrative, the biblical story that involve the miraculous interaction of God in time, space, and history were kind of removed from the story. So at the beginning, you accommodate the Darwinian story and adopt some sort of theistic evolutionary position. You deny the reality of miracles, and so you end up with what was called the social gospel.
Right.
So you don't have any longer a vertical relationship between God and man, or between nature and God, where God acts within the natural order that he otherwise sustains and upholds. Now you have just a series of ethical propositions that are to guide our political and social interactions with each other. And that's the essence of liberal theology. That was one reaction to the naturalism of the 19th century. The other was to say, well, if science leads to atheism, if art leads to debauchery, if the entertainment industry leads to debauchery, well, we're not going to do science. We're not going to do art. If philosophy leads, again, to atheism or skepticism, we're not going to do philosophy. We're going to just pull back from culture altogether. And this was the fundamentalist response.
Mm-hmm.
Now, obviously, there's a third way in there, which is that we need to and still need to engage those challenging thought forms. And as St. Paul said, we should come against every argument and pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God and subject every thought form to Christ.
Yes.
So that if there's an argument being formulated against Christianity, then there needs to be, for Christian disciples, we need not to simply withdraw or capitulate, but to argue our case back.
Mm-hmm.
That part of the knowledge of God, Paul links to our ability to see what God has done in time, space, and history, and make a case based on that evidence. This is what he does at Mars Hill in Acts 17. And so there was a lack of intellectual, cultural engagement that I think has hurt the church for now over 100 years. A lot of people have woken up to this problem. This is not my diagnosis here is not new.
Right.
I think Francis Schaeffer was a huge figure in waking up the evangelical world to this. I think Catholics and Orthodox Christians are drawing a bead on this, and maybe have had, because they're less ahistorical than we in the evangelical world, they may have had deeper intellectual roots in challenging some of this. But all of the major traditions in Christendom, I think, have been affected by naturalism and materialism, and have been on the intellectual and cultural defensive. And I think a big part of our message is that there's no need to be.
Right.
The evidence for the reality of God is very strong. There's been a huge resurgence in theistic approaches to philosophy around something called the Midwest School, associated with figures like Alvin Plantinga. My book is about the return of the God hypothesis. Yesterday, I did an interview in London with a French author and a British author who have come to similar conclusions that the evidence from nature is very powerfully supportive of belief in God. And in the area of history and archaeology, there are just reams of evidential findings now that corroborate the reality of the biblical witness. And so we really shouldn't be on the defensive, but we have been for, I think, over a century. And I think part of why we like talking to you all is we'd like, I think, jointly to see that shifted.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and it is amazing to think that in the very areas where science seemed to push God out, we're now seeing that evidence that's drawing many scientists back to the question of design. What kind of impact is that having on academic institutions, on students, on the next generation of leaders?
Those are actually three separate questions, and they're all really good. Okay. On academic institutions, there's still a lot of inertia, right? There's an old saying from a famous historian of science, Thomas Kuhn, about how scientific revolutions take place one funeral at a time.
Yeah.
You know, as an old guard, I don't wish anyone funerals, but as an old guard retires, or in some cases, maybe some of the old guards start to change their minds, but typically radical changes in thought take place as an older generation moves off the scene and a younger generation rises. So there's still, I think, a lot of inertia, a lot of reflexive commitment to a naturalistic worldview, the idea that if you're a scientist, you must absolutely reject something like intelligent design or belief in God. And we get stories from our PhD students that we've mentored who have still these hostile, proselytizing scientific atheists in physics, cosmology, astronomy, biology, the different fields.
Right.
And of course, that spreads across to the other disciplines in the humanities, English departments, and deconstructionism, and then of course the whole cultural Marxist ideology that's taken over much of the Western universities. But I think among young people, there's a dramatic shift taking place. And we're seeing that anecdotally in the numbers of applications we're getting from very sharp students to our postgraduate programs, our summer mentoring programs, and we're seeing it with young professors that are making it through tenure.
Wow!
And who have in our field in particular, biologists who are supportive of intelligent design and who are doing research from within that framework are making it through their PhDs, through their postdoctoral appointments, through their initial faculty years, and getting right through to tenure, and then even in several cases getting the research labs of their own. So you see this generational shift happening. We're also seeing it, I think, culturally. There's a survey that's been done over here. It's now been published as something called the Quiet Revival, where just the openness to religious faith, to Christian faith in particular, has shifted dramatically in the last 7 or 8 years. In Britain, might not be getting these numbers exactly right, but I was talking to the British author Justin Brierley yesterday. Justin's written a book called The Surprising Rediscovery of Belief in God. And his research on the demise of the new atheist movement, which has occurred here in Britain. It was, hugely influential thing in the early aughts, aught 7, aught 8, and now is just unraveled.
Wow.
But what if I'm getting the numbers right, in 2018 there was a survey, and it showed that church attendance in Britain among young people was at about 4%, and it's risen to 16% with 21% among young men.
Wow.
So there's been this kind of dramatic shift among younger people.
That's amazing.
As more and more are looking for something other than the kind of nihilistic, the nihilism that's a consequence of scientific materialism.
Yeah. I love it. And what kind of encouragement, as we kind of close out our time together, what kind of encouragement would you give to this rising generation of Christian scientists, educators, leaders who are exploring these kind of, cutting edge scientific theories to really kind of get us back to roots? What kind of encouragement would you give them as they're thinking in their roles in their fields?
Yeah. The broad heading would be, it's okay to have just a little swagger.
Okay.
We should not be feeling intellectually defensive. We should be feeling intellectually confident.
Wow.
Romans 1 says that God has made it plain through the things he's made. Let me just give you three key things that I talk about in the Return of the God hypothesis, and then one thing about the Bible. Okay, just quick fun facts to know and tell. The major discovery of 20th century astronomy and cosmology is that the universe, the material universe of matter, space, time, and energy, as best we can tell, had a beginning.
Yes.
Yeah.
Before which, or independent of which, there was no matter to do the causing.
Wow.
And therefore, materialistic explanations for the origin of the universe are decidedly adrift. There have been many attempts to revive some sort of infinite universe cosmologies or something from nothing cosmologies. I can tell you they're not working.
Yep.
And they're more and more convoluted, more strained, more exotic, anything but simple in the Occam's razor sense. And number two, I already talked about the fine-tuning evidence, which is a big discovery of physics. Many physicists have acknowledged that this seems on its face to point to God or to theism or some kind of transcendent intelligent designer. Others will say, hey, we've got to invoke the multiverse or else we have no way of answering that argument. But the multiverse isn't a very good argument.
Yep.
In the area where I work principally on origin of life biology, the huge discovery in molecular biology was that at the foundation of life, in the simplest living cell, we have a digital information processing system with literally digital code stored in the DNA molecule directing the construction of the molecular machines and proteins that are needed to keep cells alive. Bill Gates, our local hero back in Seattle, where I'm from, says that DNA is like a software program, but much more complex than any we've ever written. Well, where does software come from? It comes from a programmer.
Right.
And so what we've discovered at the foundation of life is arguably evidence of a master programmer for life, a transcendent, intelligent designer. And I have marshaled those three key facts and developed an argument for God's existence in my book called Return of the God Hypothesis, saying that we're coming full circle to where science started in the 16th and 17th century. In the area of biblical archaeology, we have a scholar at the Discovery Institute, Titus Kennedy, who's also contributed to some SEU classes.
Right.
And he's just documenting that across the different periods of biblical history, there is extensive corroboration of the biblical narrative in every period of biblical history, from the patriarchs to the Exodus period and conquest of Canaan, to the period of the Davidic monarchy, to the fall of Judah under Babylon, and then right up through the New Testament. And one really just a fun fact to know and tell and keep in your hip pocket is that the 7 of the figures in the trial of Christ, including all of the major figures, have been independently attested by archaeological inscriptions over the last 60 years.
Wow.
And we can think of no other ancient document that has that level of external corroboration. It's just quite extraordinary. So Pilate, Caiaphas, Herod Antipas, you go right down the list, Jesus himself.
Yeah.
So the historical reliability of the biblical documents is something that has been surprisingly, I think, extensively confirmed over the last half century, and going back to the late 19th century. And that's just one more reason among many that we should feel not intellectually insecure as people did in the late 19th century, but very confident that the Word of God is the Word of God, and the biblical worldview is a view with immense explanatory power. It makes the most sense of our experience.
Yeah,
I love it.
That's great. Well, Dr. Meyer, it's been a real honor to have you on the Framework Leadership Podcast. Love this discussion. Love this series that we're involved in. Just grateful for your voice in our university.
Yeah, I love it. If you'd like to learn more about Dr. Meyer's work, you can visit stephencmeyer.org and make sure you check out his books, The Return of the God Hypothesis, Darwin's Doubt, and Signature in the Cell. You can get them wherever you get their books. They also make fantastic audiobooks. I'm about halfway through The Return of the God Hypothesis myself on audio. Love it. And if you want to dive in more about the resources of the Discovery Institute, make sure you check them out. Discovery Institute Center for Science and Culture. Thank you so much for listening to Framework Leadership, and we'll see you next time.
Take care, everybody.
Thanks for joining us on Framework Leadership. If you're watching on YouTube, hit like and subscribe so leadership insights keep coming your way. You can also catch every episode on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And for bonus resources, subscribe to the Framework Leadership newsletter at kentingle.com. Make sure to follow us on Instagram at Kent_Ingle and at Dr. Michael Steiner, and on X at Kent_Ingle, and on Facebook at Kent.Ingle to stay up to date with the podcast and everything happening at Southeastern University.
Before you go, here's something every freedom-loving parent and patriot needs to hear. The battle for the next generation is happening right now in our classrooms and colleges, and I wrote a book to help you fight back. College Without Communism is officially out now. It's your guide to exposing the lies, defending truth, and finding real alternatives to woke indoctrination. Whether you're sending a kid to college or just to know what's really going on behind the scenes in education, this book is absolutely for you. So head to kentingle.com today. Get the truth, equip your family, and change the culture.